So we have this phenomena called cumulative advantage, or the Matthew effect. And it basically means that people who have something, or have a lot, that they get more, not because there's something special about them, but simply because they already have a lot. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that's the Matthew effect. Let's talk about the Matthew effect. And you can observe that effect in something like how successful people are. And in particular about, music or songs or videos, While most of us have little success, a few will have a ton of success. And oftentimes this is really skewed. So the ones that are really successful, they are really, really successful. This is not like a normal curve or an average successfulness that is there, but it's really skewed. So some people will be really, really successful, while most people won't be. And you see that, for example, also on YouTube, like the most viewed videos ever. What are the most viewed videos ever? Check this. Despacito. Oh, the Baby Shark. Ed Sheeran. What? Rapping my research? Let's click at that. What? Holy moly! 450 million views? Holy shit, let's check this out.
For bringing social context back in. Social context matters for social life, but in SNA, that's not always how we try. That's curious because I think all agree that dependency settings and context are key. We assume that mechanisms operate the same, but the truth and honesty, that is a bit lame. So let's bring this social context back in, together with the mechanisms that drives the thing. Is try they close stronger with it as full class, or do constraints make the whole thing a farce? We collected data from primary schools where folks have friends across classrooms, and then we threw an ergometric, but a fancy one with a new effect, a geo-weighted XChat partner term that only counts actors that are the same, and in the end we get a positive effect for how trials and context interact. Social context matters for life, but in SNA, that's not always how we drive. That's curious because I think we all agree that dependencies, settings, and context are key. It's duality of context such as classroom and school, and network mechanism that is going to rule. More generally, it shows us a future way where bridging context leads to pay. To understand what is going on in the social networks we are living on. Let me summarize the whole thing in just one line, and I promise you guys, that is my last rhyme. Our research demonstrates a positive effect for how trials and context interact. Our research demonstrates a positive effect for how trials and context interact. Thank you guys, it's been a pleasure to be here. Thanks for hanging around. It's all from me, TG Oberlin.
Oh, funny. But there's also another thing that we observe, not just this very unequal distribution of success versus non-success, but on top of that, there's an acceleration in how successful people are. So often it really takes off like that. Suddenly something just goes crazy. They really take off. Having that in mind, let me now talk about an example that Malcolm Gladwell uses in his. And there he looks at a hockey game. And in particular, he looks at the roster. He looks at the roster of a high school hockey game at the national level in Canada. And now what I ask you to do is take a minute and look at this roster. Is there something that you can spot that is a bit out of the ordinary? Well, these are kids participating in this hockey match. We have their names, their position, their weight, and their birth date. And the thing that I wanted to highlight is when we zoom in on the birth date. And what we observe here, this is the roster of I don't know, the Metzin Tigers. That's this high school team that made it to this final in Canada. And when you look at when those kids were born, what you observe is that it's over half of the kids in that team that makes it to the final in Canada in high school hockey. Over half of the players, they were born during the first 3 months of the year. So they were born either in January, February, or March. That's a bit odd. What's going on here? Somehow, kids that were born in January, February, or March, they seem to be really over proportionally represented in this team. Does it mean that kids play better hockey when they were born in January compared to kids that were born in December? What's going on? As it turns out, this is not a fluke. So we observe that in other leagues and in other sports as well. This is now a graph, some older data on minor hockey. And what we see here is the black graphs, which is like the, observed number of players that were born in a certain time during the year. And the gray bars are the number of players based on how many people were born in a certain year, a certain month. So this is the number of players that we would expect to have been born in a certain quarter of the year. And what you see is pretty striking, that again we have the same pattern, that there are more hockey players born in January, February and March, as it turns out April, May, June as well, than we would expect to find by chance alone. And it's quite startling to see how at the end of the year, October, November, December, how few players that make it into hockey were born in these months.
Hit him, light him up. Yeah, nice hit. That's solid. Juice, that's solid. Your head up, big boy.
And this gets even better. When we look at the NHL, the Professional Hockey League in North America, and we look at when were the players that get drafted into the NHL, these are the new players that come into the NHL, when were they born? What you observe is that over the years, it's a pretty consistent trend, almost 40% of the players of a given cohort that get drafted into the NHL were born in the first quarter of the year. While in contrast, only around 15% of players that get drafted into the NHL over the years were born in the fourth quarter of the year. That's a bit spooky. So this is what's going on. So in Canada, as in other countries, the cutoff birth date for trying out for hockey leagues is January 1st. So that means if you turn 5 on January the 1st, you're going to be a lot bigger and physically more mature and more coordinated than a child who turns 5 on December 31st of the same year, right? Keep in mind, for a 5-year-old kid, a 1-year-old difference really matters. Well, I have to think about my little nephew. The guy is a big guy. He's 7 years old now, but he's a head taller than the other kids in his class. So he really has an advantage. And 1 year's difference makes a huge difference for little kids. So in any given year, you have in a cohort little kids. Some were born in January and others were born in December of the same year. But the kids that were born in January, they are just much stronger than the kids that were born in December during that year, on average. Because 1 year, 10, 11, 12 months is a huge difference when you're just 5 years old. And as it turns out, the bigger kids, they can play better. They can dominate the other kids that were born 10 months later. But at an early age on, they get scouted by coaches and they get put into better teams. And then in these better and more competitive teams, the bigger kids, they will be given better coaches, more chances to play in practice and in more games. And they will also have more games against other more competitive teams. So this initial advantage that kids might have had when they were 5 years old, it doesn't go away. In fact, it amplifies. And this effect we can observe in other sports as well. So here I have a couple of data from soccer in the Czech Republic, for example. And as it turns out, over 75% of the kids were born in the first 4 months of the year. So again, it's very interesting. An initial advantage really amplifies. And that's what we call the Matthew effect. And if you've ever played Monopoly, you know what I'm talking about. So if for whatever reason you were unlucky at first, you landed on some odd spots, you couldn't buy the streets, but others did. They bought the most expensive streets and then they will get rent from you when you land on it and so on. It's really hard to recover from that. While on the other side, when you were lucky at first in the first few rounds, by chance, you really keep that advantage. And here's the quote from the Bible, and that's why this thing is called the Matthew effect. It's from the Gospel. For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. It's a very Christian thing to say, is it? Oh, it's so funny. And here are a couple of different names for the same phenomena. We call it sometimes cumulative advantage, or path-dependent increasing returns, or first mover advantage, positive feedback loops, success breeds success, monopoly effect, or even preferential attachment when we talk about networks. But it's always the same. It's that those who have something at first, for whatever reason, they get even more. They get this monopoly advantage that they then can benefit from. So here's a quote from the reading that you guys had to do from Robert K. Merton. He looked at the Matthew effect in the context of science, in the academic world. And here he says, the Matthew effect in science consists in the accruing of greater increments of recognition for particular scientific contributions to scientists of considerable repute, and the withholding of such recognition from scientists who have not yet made their mark. So basically what he says here is that if for whatever reasons you already have been successful in the academic world, let's say you wrote a book or a research article and people know you, then Merton observes that because of that, you'll get even more recognition afterwards. While in contrast, if you haven't made your mark yet, it's really difficult to break in because people don't know you yet and they don't take you that serious. Merton looked at this in the context of Nobel Prizes. And here we also observe that, somebody who wins a Nobel Prize, after winning the Nobel Prize, that person gets cited much, much more. It's almost like that Nobel Prize, gives that person recognition, and because of that, others then give even more recognition to that person. A funny Nobel Prize story: when I was still living in Sweden, in Stockholm, at my research institute, we had invited Thomas Schelling. And Thomas Schelling, when he was still alive, he was a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And a good friend of mine, he picked him up at the airport. Like Thomas Schelling travels with his wife, and they sit in the taxi, and my Swedish friend makes a bit of small talk. And that was the weekend where one of the Swedish princesses, here in this picture, got married. And my Swedish friend, he talks about it and says, oh, that princess, she just got married. And then Thomas Schelling says, oh yeah, I met her once, I had dinner with her. And my Swedish friend, he didn't really know who Thomas Schelling was, but he knew the princess. So he was like, what? You met the princess? You had dinner with the princess? How the hell did that happen? And then Thomas Schelling's wife says in this very calm voice, well, my husband, he got invited to this dinner at once because of this prize that he got. Little did my friend knew that was the Nobel Prize He was a bit embarrassed, but nevertheless, it makes a great story. But there really is something to it. So, for example, an article or research published by somebody with an affiliation that is very prestigious, right? For example, Harvard University, University of Chicago or Oxford and so on. Just because that person has that affiliation, that article tends to get greater peer recognition than if it was written by somebody affiliated with a less prestigious university. That's pretty unfair. Just because somebody is at a prestigious university, that does not mean that that work of that person is greater than the work of somebody who's not at a prestigious university. And while Merton originally developed this idea of the Matthew effect in the context of scientific careers, like folks like me at the university, this is a more general mechanism for inequality across any temporal process. And you really observe that with the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So it is a much more general mechanism that we can extend to other aspects of life as well. Let me talk about a couple of experiments in that regard. A paper written by Arnoud van der Royt and colleagues in 2014, and you guys had to read that. And in that paper, they do experiments to see whether they can replicate this effect. So Arnoud van der Royt and others, they say the success breeds success hypothesis claims that the ultimate success of select persons may be born out of small random initial advantages that grow ever larger through runaway positive feedback. Basically, they're saying there could be small, tiny, random initial advantages that have come about in whatever way, and that these initial advantages that they amplify. And having that hypothesis, the question then becomes, could we potentially use that? Could one increase the likelihood of success in the future of somebody or something by bestowing success on somebody or something in the present? And that's what they went out to study. And I have a video where Arnoud explains that in more detail in the context of a study they did on Wikipedia.
So one hypothesis that we had was a fuzzy sociological hypothesis. We thought that it is the positive karma, if you will, the positive sentiment, the appreciation that is being expressed by one editor of Wikipedia to another that motivates the editors, that gives them a sense of community. And this is a fuzzy sociological explanation, but in this particular day and age, these fuzzy sociological explanations can be tested. For example, in Wikipedia, we were able to put our finger on exactly what the transmission of positive sentiment is, because there are very concrete items in the web logs of Wikipedia that denote the giving of such a thing. For example, there is a Barn Star. This is an unofficial award that one editor can give to another as a token of appreciation that says, thank you very much for your contributions. And this Barn Star is a signature that we can track, because the volume of Wikipedia is freely available online. And so we can look at the Barn Star and see what happens to productivity before and after that Barn Star. Now, when you look at the records of Wikipedia, typically what you see is that there's a spike in contribution volume followed by decay. And at the top of that spike is where the Barn Star occurs. So that would suggest that the Barn Star has a counterproductive effect, whereby the productivity goes down after the Barn Star. Now, the problem with observational data is that we cannot tease out cause and effect. We do not know if the Barn Star caused the decline or if that decline was going to happen anyway. And that was maybe just a spike that led to the Barn Star. In order to disentangle these, we need to perform an experiment. And so that's what we set out to do. We went into Wikipedia as editors, and we handed out Barn Stars to individuals who deserved them. But we handed them out after we first flipped a coin to decide if the individual is going to be in the control group or the experimental group. So that means that we have two identical populations in expectation, control group and experimental group. Only the people in the experimental group get the Barn Star. And now, if we look at productivity after the Barn Star, we should be able to see if there is indeed a positive or a negative effect of receiving a positive token of appreciation. So here's a graph to the left of me. We see two curves again. a red curve that is here at the bottom. The x-axis is time, the y-axis is contribution level, and what we see is that the cumulative productivity goes up to the point where we give the barn store, this vertical line over here, and then increases but only slightly. This is contrasted to the blue line, which up to the giving of the barn star overlaps with the red line because they are identical groups and because nothing has distinguished these people yet. But then the people in the blue group who do get our barn star, they exhibit heightened levels of productivity as indicated by this higher curve. And so this illustrates that with the experiment we were able to find the opposite effect. It is indeed true that positive rewards increase contributions levels, and these are an informal money system, if you will. There's informal tokens of appreciations that's basically substitute what in other markets or other systems is money, and it helps people stay motivated and contribute all that Wikipedia content, and in the end produce a worldwide encyclopedia that is used by many people, and all they need is an internet connection.
But they didn't just do that on Wikipedia, so they repeated a similar kind of experiment in other domains as well. For example, they went on this website called Kickstarter. Does that still exist? I don't know. Well, Kickstarter was or is a crowdsourcing website. So basically you can have an idea for a project and you can ask people to support you and to pledge money to support your project. And what they did here, they randomly selected projects that hadn't received any donations yet. And then half of those they treated as the control condition, they didn't do anything with them. But the other half, they pledged and donated money to. So they gave projects money without looking at what they were about. Just randomly selected some of the projects that hadn't received any donations yet. And then after a while, they kind of checked how many other people did donate money to these projects compared to the ones where nobody had given money to. Lastly, they also went to a website called change.org. That's an online petition platform. Again, you can make a petition on anything that you want and ask people to support you to literally digitally sign your petition. And again, they went to petitions and randomly bestowed success, like signatures, to some petitions but not to others. And then they compared how they fared over the time. So here's a summary of what they did. On Kickstarter, they donated money to random projects and count subsequent funding given by third parties like other people afterwards. On e-opinions, they gave these not helpful ratings to a review and then count the ratings that other individuals gave to the same review afterwards or to the same product. On Wikipedia, they gave these editing awards to random editors, and then they counted subsequent awards given by other people to these editors. And on change.org, they added signatures to random petitions and subsequently counted the signatures that were given to the same petitions by yet other people, like third parties. And this is the finding, which is pretty cool. So we have the light gray bars, which are the control conditions. This is where they didn't do anything. Either they didn't give money, they didn't change the rating, they didn't give an award, and they didn't add signatures to something. And then you have the dark gray bars, which correspond to the experimental condition. So these are the cases where success was artificially bestowed upon something. Across all four domains, we observe that when something received artificial success at first, it actually turned out to be more successful afterwards. This is another graph from the paper. It summarizes it. So we have the time, of the observation period that they have and the success, both on a standardized scale from 0 to 1. And what you want to do here now is you want to compare the solid lines with the dashed lines. Yeah. So for example, the blue lines correspond to the funding experiment on Kickstarter. And then you see the solid line, what is the average success of campaigns when these campaigns received random donations at first. While the dash blue lines shows the increase in average success for projects that did not get this initial donation from the researchers. And in all cases, the solid line is higher than the dashed line. So making something look successful at first seems to be a strategy to actually make it become successful in the eyes of others afterwards. It gets even more interesting than this. So in the Kickstarter experiment, they could show that for every dollar that they randomly donated on a project that didn't receive any donation so far, for every dollar that they gave to that project, so for every dollar that the researchers donated to a project that hadn't received any donations yet, that led to others donating money as well, which was an average $1.15. So the researchers donated $1, and because of that, others donated even more than that. So if you would be super clever, you would donate to yourself to artificially make you look successful, because that pays for others to then donate even more money to you. Anyway, so here's causal evidence for success breeds success dynamics in a variety of substantive domains. It's a great paper. I really love it. It's very straightforward. I can highly recommend it. But it also means that strategic actors can effectively invest in positive feedback. And in many ways, again, this is a big area of marketing these days. You know, we could actually artificially make something look successful in order to make it even more successful afterwards. But it also means that, for example, governments could jumpstart support for something. But it doesn't always work. Anyway, so much about success breeds success dynamics and the Matthew effect. Take care.